Let's talk about the book of Numbers. We're going to see just how much of this we get through, but this is going to be a major exception in the way we've been trekking through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and so forth. Because we've been doing our best to go as chronologically as possible, even though we kind of had to jump around a little bit just to make some of the kind of complicated things going on in these first 5 books of the Bible as clear as possible. But now that we've gotten into this next big section of the book of Numbers, going through it mostly chronologically or purely chronologically would require us to repeat ourselves so many times, go back over so many things, so many repeated times that we'd be looking at probably, 10 hours of video, and most of it would be repetition. There's a very simple reason for that. It's because the narrative of Numbers 11 through 17, this kind of major section of the book of Numbers, is purposefully repetitive. It is purposefully showing us a repetitive pattern, a repetitive cycle in the life of ancient Israel. Of course, in the process, it's showing us something about ourselves. It is showing us something about the God of the universe. It is showing us something about the way that sin works in our hearts and our minds. And it's showing us something about the way the Lord redeems and restores. But I think that the best way to get the message, to grasp it as clearly as possible today, is to go not chronologically through it so that we tell the entire story and then we tell the exact same story over again when it repeats itself, and then we tell the exact same story over again when it repeats itself, and on and on and on and on. I think that the best, clearest, simplest, most helpful way to tell the story, to break down Numbers 11 through 17, is to take a big step back and tell the big story of what is happening in these chapters. So we're going to collapse a lot of things together. We're not going to leave a bunch of stuff out, but we're going to talk about these very repetitive episodes throughout Numbers 11 through 17 all together. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. And in that process, there's a handful of things that happen in the middle of this section that we're going to talk about near the end. There's a handful of things that happen near the end of this section that we're going to talk about here kind of near the beginning, and on and on and on. And so this is going to be mostly not chronological. Now, we're still going to be chronological in the sense that we're going to talk about the first big rebellion that happens, and then the second big rebellion, and the third big rebellion, and so on and so forth. But we're going to jump around between the different rebellions so that we can talk about what they are teaching us about who God is and what He's like and what He wants for us and from us, as well as how we've been broken by the fall and how the redeeming work of the long-promised Savior, Jesus, fixes what is broken in us and rescues us from the condemnation that comes from our sin and rebellion as clearly as possible. And so just like always, I'm going to assume that if you were watching this video, you have probably been watching the rest of the videos leading up to this in this video series, or at the very least, that you have read up to this point in the book of Numbers. But I know that because of the way that we're having to tackle this, inevitably there will be some kind of gaps. There will be some things that you read in Numbers chapter 11 on that day that don't get covered in the part of the video you're able to watch. There'll be some things in Numbers 12 when you read on that day that won't be covered in the part of the video you watch. There will be some things in Numbers 13 and 14 and 15 and on and on and on. But I think the best way to go about this is for you to think about Numbers 11 through 17 as one big whole, one big piece of the puzzle all together. It's a little bit too much probably for you to read all in one day, but you could say that this is one big section of the story. This is kind of one, if it was a TV show, this would be one big episode. And so we're going to tackle Numbers 11 through 17 as if it is one big episode in the story of the book of Numbers. But the thing that we have to bear very deeply in mind as we jump into this big section of the book of Numbers is that just like we've seen the Lord repeat over and over and over throughout this book, Yahweh has specially chosen, specially preordained, specially selected, divinely set apart, divinely anointed, divinely ordained, divinely empowered certain people for certain roles. Different tribes within Israel for different functions. Different people among his covenant people to play different parts in his redemptive plan, redemptive mission, in his kingdom work. Not every Israelite is meant to play the same role in God's plan to redeem humanity and restore the world. The Levites have one role over here. The Reubenites have this other role over here. The Judahites have this other role over here, and on and on and on. Different tribes play different parts. Different groups have different roles. Different families have different functions, and that is a good thing, not a bad thing. It glorifies the Lord that different people among his family and his kingdom and his children are different. It is good that I am different than my wife. It is good that she is different than her brother. It is good that you are different than the person in the other room of your house right now. It is good that some of the people in my church are different than some of the other people in the church, and on and on and on. Same way that it's good that men are different from women and women are different from men. That's not a bad thing. The fact that women are often biologically wired and just through years and years and years of conditioning and other things like that, tend to be different than most men, tend to have different strengths than most men. That's a good thing about women. That's not a bad thing. The differences don't make women inferior. And in the same way, the things about men that are different from women, the fact that we tend to work very differently, we're biologically wired very differently, and we've been conditioned very differently through years and years and years, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Each of the differences between different types of people reflect different aspects of God's glory. God is glorified by the person who has these gifts, but not those gifts. He is glorified by the person over here who has these gifts instead of those gifts. He is glorified by this person over here who has these gifts instead of those gifts, who has these strengths instead of those, these other strengths instead of those, these other strengths instead of those, and on and on and on. So I reflect God's creative glory in a very specific and unique way. You reflect God's creative glory in a very different, unique way. That other person over there reflects his creative glory in another different and unique way, and so on and so forth. And each of us has in some way been created and conditioned, curated, molded, prepared, empowered, wired, and so forth in order to be able to play a very unique, specific, important role in God's plan and purpose and mission. And we see a clear illustration of that principle at work in the ancient Israelites. The ancient Israelites were divided into different tribes, and they were given different jobs, different roles, and so forth. They were set apart to reflect God's goodness and glory in unique, special, different ways. And the very important thing for us to remember in all of this is that Yahweh is the only one who gets any say in what those roles are. Yahweh alone can divinely choose, set apart, ordain people for various roles in his covenant purpose and mission. Yahweh repeatedly makes it clear throughout the book of Numbers, and especially throughout this section, that he alone has the right to ordain prophets or priests or kings. He is the only one who has the authority to ordain teachers and shepherds and so forth. He is the only one who has any power, any right, any authority, anything at all. He is the only one who can authoritatively pronounce, this person is in charge. These people will follow. This person can speak on my behalf. Those people will listen. This person can carry out my rituals. Those people will participate in them based on their part. This person can lead us out to war. Those people will follow behind them, and on and on and on. We as humans cannot self-declare, I am a prophet. We cannot just kind of declare about ourselves, I am a priest. I am the leader. I am the one in charge. We cannot declare, I speak for the Lord. I will show you what he wants, and so on and so forth. Only person who can set someone apart for any specific role, whether it is a leadership role or a follower role, whatever, the only person who can set us apart, ordain us, specially, divinely choose us for any given role to play in his work is Yahweh himself. I think the way that Numbers 12, 6-8 puts this is extremely important. It says, now hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. My servant Moses, however, is not so. He is faithful in all my house. With him I will speak mouth to mouth, even plainly, and not in riddles, and he shall see Yahweh's form. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Yahweh is saying to Miriam and Aaron during a really tense argument between Moses and Miriam and Aaron. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But God says to them in that moment, I am the one who makes myself known to prophets, and I will make myself known to them in whatever form I choose. If I make myself known to them through a vision, then I will do that. If I make myself known to them through a dream, I will do that. If it's some other way, I will do that. I have chosen to make myself known to Moses by speaking to him face to face, mouth to mouth, to speak to him plainly, not in riddles. I have chosen to allow Moses to see my form. I have chosen to make Moses into someone you should be afraid to speak against. I have chosen to make Moses my unique servant in a unique way that cannot be said about anybody else alive at this time. He says, I am Yahweh, and Yahweh chooses who Yahweh uses. Yahweh chooses how he uses them. Yahweh chooses what role they play. Yahweh chooses how they will carry out that role. Yahweh chooses what they can and cannot do, where they can and cannot go, where they can and cannot live, who they can and cannot speak to, and so on and so forth. Yahweh alone has the right and authority to ordain prophets or priests or kings or whatever, such as Moses. And because that is true, Yahweh says, Numbers 12, 8 and 9, picking it up right where we left off. He says, why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? It says, Yahweh's anger burned against them, and he departed. God is declaring to Miriam and Aaron that denying God's clear choosing, setting apart, consecrating, anointing, ordaining of Moses in this unique way is to actively rebel against God's own divine authority. To say, I do not believe that Moses is who God has said that he is to say, I do not believe Yahweh. To say, I do not believe that Moses has the right or authority to speak to us on God's behalf is actually not to knock against Moses. That is a knock against Yahweh. It's saying that what God has clearly revealed about Moses is not true. It's saying God was lying when he told us Moses is his unique servant, or God was wrong when he chose Moses to be his unique servant, to rule over us. The big picture that we're meant to take away here is not primarily a message about Moses himself, although it is absolutely true. Moses was the unique kind of prophet king over the Israelites during that moment in time, during his generation, in a very unusual way that we would not see happen for most of history after that point. We see it in the case of Moses. We see it to a lesser extent in the case of Joshua, which again we will talk about later. Moses was very much unique during the days of the Old Covenant. So that is true, but that's not the main point we ought to be taking away here. It's very common for pastors, preachers, teachers, and stuff to preach on these passages and say, like, that's why you should never question your pastor. Your pastor is God's man, blah, blah, blah. That is not how these passages are meant to be applied. The point here is not treat your pastor like Moses, because your pastor is not like Moses. And just to be clear, I am not like Moses. I absolutely should be questioned sometimes. I get it wrong often. Moses also got it wrong. But I don't have a historically unique divine calling placed on me the way that Moses did. I have the same calling as any other pastor. Sometimes it may be necessary to speak against me. I may get very much on the wrong track and cause all kinds of problems, all kinds of harm. That is never the right application of passages like this. What's happening here in Numbers 11 through 17 is that Moses is the example, and the principle that this example is illustrating is that Yahweh alone can divinely choose and set apart and ordain people for their roles in his covenant purpose and mission. Yahweh alone has the right and authority to ordain prophets and priests and kings such as Moses. So when the Israelites denied God's clear ordaining work in choosing Moses in this very unique way, they were actively rebelling against God's own divine authority. This tells us very little about how we should deal with our normal, everyday human leaders in the church. But it tells us everything about how we should deal with Yahweh in his ordaining work, his choosing work, his setting apart work, his empowering work. Yahweh has the right to set anyone apart for any role he chooses. We see an example of that in Numbers 11:29. Joshua comes up to Moses because he's very worried that there's a large group of elders in the camp who have begun seemingly prophesying by the Spirit of God, speaking on behalf of the Lord, speaking words that the Lord has given them. And he comes to this Moses, hey, there's a bunch of people prophesying and none of them are you. Should I be worried about this? But Moses says to him, Numbers 11:29, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all of Yahweh's people were prophets, that Yahweh would put his Spirit on all of them. Moses is explaining to Joshua that all of God's people are ultimately meant to bear God's Spirit the way that we do today, now, because of the cross that has broken down the wall between us and him. Because Jesus is our mediator now, if you are a follower of Jesus, you do have the Holy Spirit. He says all of God's people are meant to bear God's Spirit and prophesy his words, and any faithful prophet who is clearly speaking by the power of the Lord is a servant of the Lord and is an ally of Moses. In other words, Joshua says, hey, those guys over there are prophesying. I'm a little worried. They might be stirring up a rebellion. And Moses says, no, listen, they're clearly prophesying by the Spirit of God. And that's exactly what we want. The fact that they are clearly prophesying by God's Spirit, that he is clearly giving them words, and then they are faithfully speaking those words to the people, that demonstrates that God has divinely chosen, divinely set apart, divinely ordained them to prophesy on his behalf. And therefore, we need to treat their prophesying as an extension of God's speech, an extension of God's purpose, an extension of God's plan and will and mission. They are carrying out the role God has given them in his mission and purpose, just like I'm carrying out the role God has given to me. In other words, he's saying, I don't get to choose who is a true prophet of the Lord, who is a true priest of the Lord, who is a true ruler on the Lord's behalf. Yahweh alone gets to choose. Those elders could not choose this for themselves. The Lord chose this for them. I cannot choose this for them. The Lord chose it for them. You cannot choose this for them. The Lord chose it for them. Faithfulness to the Lord looks like joyfully, submissively, willingly embracing your God-given role that he has divinely chosen for you in his plan, purpose, and mission. That is a very long prologue, but everything else we're going to talk about in Numbers 11 through 17 requires us to be rock solid on that fact. Nothing else that happens in Numbers 11 through 17 makes any sense unless we grasp that. Yahweh alone can divinely choose, set apart, ordain people for various roles in his covenant mission and purpose. And the reason that we needed to talk about that before we talk about Numbers 11 verse 1, because what we see happening throughout the rest of Numbers 11 through 17 is an escalating spirit of rebellion taking hold of God's people that moves them to reject his God-given, divinely chosen roles for them. We see the people of God rebelling in deeper and deeper and deeper ways, grow more and more and more destructive, that require the Lord to crush larger and larger and larger mobs of outright rebels against God's will, God's ways, and God's clear, explicit command. We see rebellions fomenting over the course of these chapters that threaten to straight up derail God's plan to redeem humanity and restore our world. And so let's look at this escalating pattern of rebellion. We're finally starting at Numbers 11:1 now. We're going to jump a little bit ahead before we could jump to the beginning. But as we trek into Numbers 11 through 17, it introduces one of the key themes of the book of Numbers, which is that Israel's primary enemy is not external attackers. Israel's primary enemy is not Gentiles that will wage war on them. Israel's primary enemy is not the pagans in the surrounding nations. Israel's primary enemy is its own sinful nature. And that same exact thing is true for me and you. The greatest threat to your Christian life will never be the U.S. government, although it can do all kinds of damage. 100%, no doubt. It will never be Drag Queen Story Hour. It will never be the Witchcraft Coven. It will never be anti-Christian forces that are in some way trying to stop you from living out your faith, trying to pressure you into outright disobedience to the Lord. Those things may absolutely come. They may absolutely happen in plenty of ways. They already do, right? Right now, America has two viciously anti-biblical parties. There is a left-wing anti-biblical party. There is a right-wing anti-biblical party. The Democrats are constantly trying to bait us into rebelling against the Lord in left-wing ways. The Republican Party is constantly, pretty effectively baiting us into rebelling against the Lord in right-wing ways while slapping a little Jesus fish bumper sticker onto it. Don't ask me which one's worse. I don't know. I wouldn't mind if they both just got in a bus and then drove off the edge of the earth. Right now, we have a whole bunch of TV personalities. Some of them actively try to bait us into rebelling against the Lord by walking away from the faith. Others actively try to bait us into rebelling against the Lord in ways that sound very good, that sound very family values oriented, that sound very traditional and so on and so forth, but are ultimately all still forms of radical rebellion. And so it is absolutely true that the world is a real threat. And it is absolutely true that the devil is a real threat. And yet the primary threat that our Christian life faces at every moment of our life is not the world and it's not the devil. Those are secondary and tertiary threats. The primary threat that we face to our Christian life is always our sinful nature. It is always the flesh. And that same thing is true for the ancient Israelites, just like it is for us. And so we see this cycle of rebellion, followed by greater rebellion, followed by greater rebellion, followed by greater rebellion. Let's talk about the first rebellion. We're just going to call this the kind of unspecified complaining incident. Numbers 11, starting in verse 1, it says, "The people were complaining in the ears of Yahweh. When Yahweh heard it, his anger burned." It said, "The mixed multitude that was among them lusted exceedingly, and the children of Israel wept again." It goes on like this for a while, but it says, "When Yahweh heard it, his anger burned. Yahweh's fire burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp." Essentially what happens here is this. The Israelites have grown extremely dissatisfied in a way that is never specified here. What they do specify, though, is that they are becoming openly hostile toward both Moses and Yahweh. We can see based on the things that they say. This word that gets translated to complaining is not wrong exactly, but saying that this is complaining is kind of like saying that stabbing someone with a sword is, fencing. It's like, well, yeah, I guess technically what you guys were doing was fencing, but you also stabbed them with a sword and killed them. That's a different thing than going to fencing class. So this is complaining, but it's much more than just complaining. What's happening is that after having personally witnessed Yahweh defeat Egypt, divide the sea, provide water miraculously for them, supply manna for them, literally make it rain bread in the desert, forgive their open rebellion from the golden calf incident back in Exodus, dwell with Israel in a pillar of smoke and fire, personally guide and protect them throughout the journey, the Israelites are still now ignoring all of those things, and instead they are accusing Yahweh of treating them badly. They are accusing Yahweh of neglecting to provide for them. They are accusing Yahweh of being worse toward them than Pharaoh. This is open slander. And the really important thing for us to grasp is that these specific complaints that we see them making here in Numbers 11 are pointing toward the beginnings of a full-on mutiny. This is the beginnings of a full-on, open rebellion. This is not simply a moment of momentary doubt or momentary dissatisfaction. We all experience that at different points. We'll see Moses experience that later in this section. But what's happening right now is the sort of thing that ultimately leads to overthrowing the God-appointed leaders and creating their own false kingdom instead, if these early signs of mutiny are just allowed to fester. I love the way that Numbers 11:10 puts it. It says, "Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, every man at the door of his tent, and Yahweh's anger burned greatly, and Moses was displeased." The men of Israel are literally gathering together at the doors of their tents. The term that this is using is one of the terms you would often use to describe kind of the men of each household preparing for some kind of battle, preparing for war, preparing to form like a militia or a mob. So this is quite literally, this is the beginning. This is how it starts when you form an angry mob to go overthrow the leaders and usurp power over the group. This is the beginning of a mutiny. And so the Lord fires this kind of warning shot. We saw the fire at the edge of the camp. Now we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how God deals with each of these rebellions in just a little bit. But first, we just want to talk about each of the rebellions in themselves. So that's kind of rebellion number one. There's this sort of unspecified complaining incident. But there's a lot more happening there than it seems like. But this very quickly escalates into a second rebellion that breaks out. This is one you could call like the meat incident or the meat rebellion, the quail incident. Numbers 11:4-6, it says, the mixed multitude that was among them lusted exceedingly, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now we have lost our appetite. There is nothing at all except this manna to look at. So this is the second episode of the rebellion arc. The Israelites have determined that manna is not good enough anymore. The bread that God has been faithfully raining from the sky for them now for years is no longer enough for them. And they demand meat. They say, we got a protein max. They say, God, we're going to be protein deficient if all we have is this manna and other stuff like that. You better give us some meat. Specifically, they accuse Yahweh of holding out on them. This is very much like what the serpent says to Eve. The serpent says, you will not really die when you eat from that tree. You will become like God. God's holding out on you. He's trying to keep you down. They're accusing God of holding out on them. They're accusing God of giving them the bare minimum. In other words, they are rejecting his generosity. They are actively denying his generosity. They're saying, you are not a generous God who faithfully rains bread down from the heavens for us. You are a tight-fisted God who refuses to give us the meat that we deserve. They are rejecting the notion that Yahweh has their best interests at heart. They're saying, you didn't bring us out here to bless us. You brought us out here to jerk us around. You brought us out here to kill us. You are tormenting us by not giving us what we truly need. Daily manna falling from the skies was an unmistakable example of God's generosity and trustworthiness and constant provision, but they are now actively rejecting that premise outright. They're actively denying that this is an example of any of those things. They are now declaring that the God who rescued them from slavery and has provided for them in the wilderness all this time headed towards the promised land is a tyrant, just like Pharaoh. They are treating him like one of the false pagan gods. This is a revolt against him. That is the second major rebellion we see playing out in this cycle. And as a result, in this headspace in which their hearts have drifted from the Lord, we see that pattern of rebellion escalating even further. We see one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. Let's call this the refusal to enter Canaan incident, the refusal to enter the promised land incident. Numbers 13:1-3 says, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, send men that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, everyone a prince among them. Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran according to the commandment of Yahweh. All of them were men who were heads of the children of Israel. We then see later down the line in Numbers 13, it says, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up this way by the south and go up into the hill country, see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell therein are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, what the land is that they dwell in, whether it is good or bad, and what cities they are that they dwell in, whether in camps or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it is fat or lean, whether there is wood therein or not. Be courageous and bring some of the fruit of the land. So essentially what happens is this: one representative from each of the tribes is sent to scout out the promised land and formulate a battle plan for how to enter safely. So it's really important to know they are not being sent out so that they can determine whether it is safe to go into the promised land. They're going into the promised land. That is literally what they're here for. They have trekked all the way from Egypt. They are now at the edge of the promised land. They are going to go in. Where else are they going to go? They're either going to enter the promised land or be stuck in the desert, and they cannot survive just stuck in the desert. They need to settle somewhere long term. They need to camp down permanently so that they can establish agriculture, so that they can build settlements and villages and cities and so on and so forth. Wandering through the desert is not a sustainable thing. And so nobody would be going into this thinking, okay, there's a possibility we may not go in. So they're not there to go see whether or not it makes sense for the Israelites to enter the promised land. They are going to scope out the best way to enter the promised land and then settle down there. Which routes do we need to go to? Which routes do we need to avoid? Which military encampments do we need to pass by? Who are we probably going to have to fight? Which part of the land that's easily inhabitable right now is most likely to be able to support us in the short term? And on and on and on. They're there to formulate a battle plan to enter the promised land as safely, as quickly, as simply as possible. Now, when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 1, we're going to get a little bit more context for this, because Deuteronomy chapter 1 clarifies that the Israelites themselves demanded that Moses send scouts to go check out the promised land, and then God permitted it. So what's happening here, ironically, is this: it is wise to send scouts to go scope out the promised land. That's a good idea. That's the right move. God says in Deuteronomy 1 that it pleased him for them to send scouts. That was the right move. However, the reason they're sending scouts is not out of wisdom. The reason they're sending scouts is out of faithlessness. The Israelites demanded that Moses send scouts because they are anxious about whether they will be able to safely settle in the promised land or not. Now, being anxious in itself is not faithlessness. That doesn't mean that you lack faith. But what's happening here is, after God has repeatedly demonstrated that he will work everything out in his people's favor, still, they're not actually confident that they will be able to get into the promised land and settle there safely. They are still convinced that if the Canaanites attack us, we will die. If the Canaanites attack us, we will lose everything. If the Canaanites don't let us in, then we can't go in. So they demand that Moses send spies in. God permits it. And it goes very, very, very badly. It says, Numbers 13, 23 through 27, they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bore it on a staff between two. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs. The place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the children of Israel cut down from there. They returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days. They went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel, to the wilderness of Paran, to Kadesh, and brought word to them and to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. They told him and said, "We came to the land to which you sent us. Surely it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." So the first thing that they find is the spies find such abundant fruit and resources in the land that it becomes abundantly clear that they will be well taken care of if they settle there in the promised land. That if they carry out God's command, if they enter the promised land, if they trust him to clear the promised land out for them, to make a home there for them, to settle down there, it's going to go well. They are going to have abundant food and resources. They are going to have abundantly arable land. They're going to have abundant capacity for agriculture and so on and so forth. That if they settle in the land and then they put in the work to work that land, it is going to be glorious. That is the first thing they find. But there is a problem. And that is that the scouts are so intimidated by the strength and the size of the Anakim armies who are there in the land already, that they completely lose their nerve and they declare that the land is unconquerable. This is one of the most tragic moments in the entire Old Testament. Numbers 13, beginning with verse 28, it says, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. They go on a few verses later, it says, but the men who went up with him said, we aren't able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. They brought up an evil report of the land which they had spied out to the children of Israel, saying, this land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land which eats up its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Now, there's a few important things to grasp here. They use this phrase, they say, this is a land that eats up its inhabitants. That was a very common phrase in the ancient Near East that seems to have had kind of a military sense to it. Like, this is a land where there was constant warfare. The people who live in this land are constantly at war with each other, constantly at war with others. In other words, the people of this land are very accustomed to fighting in a way that we, a bunch of former slaves with no combat experience, are not. They are men of great stature. In other words, these are people who are physically well equipped for warfare. These are people who could absolutely kill us if they wanted to. Then they said they were Nephilim. So they were sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. Now, in the ancient Near East, in ancient Jewish tradition especially, there were a lot of different kind of folk legends related to the Nephilim. We talked a little bit about this back in Genesis. We have no idea whether Genesis chapter 6 is talking about literal half angel, half human offspring type things that were literally giants, or whether it was simply talking about kind of a great warrior class that was descended from powerful warriors, powerful kings, powerful chieftains, and so forth. There are different views among different kind of scholarly streams, and they both have very good arguments for those views. Whatever the case, we really don't know. The Nephilim would most likely have been wiped out in the flood, however, because the flood happens and it wiped out all life on earth except those in the ark, those in the sea, and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of uncertainty here. We don't know if this means that literally the inhabitants of Canaan, the Anakim and so forth, were literally descendants of the Nephilim who somehow survived the flood. I think that's unlikely. That seems to defeat the point of the flood story. So we don't know if it's that, or if it is simply, they are referring to them as Nephilim, kind of rhetorically. It's like they were so big, so powerful, it's like they were Nephilim. It's like they were that ancient warrior class from back in the day. It could be something like that. Or it could be that their faithlessness has turned them superstitious, which happens to us today too, right? So they could have taken on some kind of superstitious nonsense beliefs as a result of their growing spirit of faithlessness and rebellion. They could have kind of convinced themselves, there are Nephilim there, we gotta run. Even though the Nephilim most likely are dead. Whatever they were. Supernatural or just some warrior class, almost certainly drowned a very, very long time ago. The point is they come back, and rather than doing their job is to map out how to enter the promised land. That is their one job. Instead, they come and they say, we better not enter the promised land. That would be like if I, as a pastor, got up on Sunday morning and instead of, preaching a sermon from Scripture, I got up and said, hey, don't read the Scriptures. Okay, let's pray and then leave. I'm doing the opposite of my job. But they are so intimidated by the strength and the size of the Anakim that they completely lose their nerve and they declare that the promised land is unconquerable. And the problem with that is declaring that the promised land is unconquerable is actively contradicting the God who said, I will conquer the promised land for you and through you. So what's happening is the spies are actively denying the truth of God's power, saying God cannot possibly have the power to conquer these inhabitants of the promised land. They're denying the truth of God's provision. They're saying there's no way that God will provide us the power to conquer the promised land. They say we are like grasshoppers in comparison to the Canaanites. By implication, what they're saying is God's presence with us cannot overcome the differences between us and those Canaanites. The power of God at work in us cannot overcome those Canaanites. Saying the difference in strength, the difference in resources, the difference in human military prowess between the Israelites and the Canaanites is too great. God either cannot do it or won't do it or was lying when he said he would do it. Whatever the case, we cannot enter the promised land. We cannot do what the Lord said. We need to turn around. We need to go back to Egypt. That is the third major rebellion that we see playing out here. The refusal to enter Canaan rebellion. But then it actually gets somehow even worse, because eventually they realize that they made a terrible mistake and they missed the boat entirely. And they try to reverse course, but not in a repentant way. The Israelites try to walk back their previous rebellion by refusing to enter the promised land, by now instead storming the promised land, attacking fortresses within the promised land without God's permission. And so this is the fourth kind of incident in this pattern of escalating rebellion. You could call this like the unauthorized conquest incident. One of the things that we see consistently throughout the Old Testament is that the Israelites were not allowed to just go fight whoever they wanted to. They were not allowed to just go attack any other nation, any other army that they felt like. They were not allowed to just go fight people, conquer them, and then take the spoils. They were not allowed to just go do whatever they wanted. The relationship God's people have with the Lord is not a relationship where he just says, I favor you over other people. I like you better than other people. I am going to give you an advantage over other people. This is favoritism. That is not the relationship that God's people have with him. This is not a favoritistic relationship. Being the people of God is not about privileges. Being the people of God is about responsibility. It is about calling. It is about mission. It is about purpose. As the people of God, we have been given a new calling and a new purpose and a new mission. We've been given a new identity. We have been given kingdom work to do. Becoming the people of God means we become his hands and feet because we are his children, because we are his friends, because we are his kingdom citizens, because we are his beloved people. And so there is not one instance throughout the entirety of the Old Testament in which God sends the Israelites out and says, okay, go fight that army, go kill those people, go take all their stuff because I think they suck and I think you're great. There is never a time where anything like that happens. Every time one of the surrounding pagan nations within the Promised Land is defeated, it is because they are being righteously judged by the God of the universe. And the tool God is using to pour out his righteous judgment on their wickedness, idolatry and injustice is the Israelites. He pours out his righteous judgment on these wicked cultures that have conquered, raped, pillaged, burned, stolen the land of smaller, weaker tribes for years and years and years to become powerful empires and so forth. He is laying waste to those wicked conquest tribes through a smaller, weaker tribe called the Israelites. There's a poetic justice to what is happening. The Lord is carrying out his kingdom work of righteously pouring his judgment out on the wicked, avenging the wickedness and injustice poured out upon the weak by those wicked nations through the exact type of smaller, weaker nation that they have been mercilessly conquering, raping, pillaging, burning, stealing from for centuries. That is what is happening. What that means is the Israelites do not have permission to just go fight anybody they want. They do not have permission to just go kill anybody they want. They do not have permission to just go plunder anybody they want. They can only ever go out in battle when Yahweh himself, the true general and commander of the army, says, go. If God says, go fight these people, then the Israelites must go fight these people. They disobeyed that when they refused to enter the promised land. But at the same time, if Yahweh has not said, now go fight these people today, then Israelites cannot go fight these people. And so they have now disobeyed a second time because the order to go attack these fortresses in the promised land has expired. It expired when they said no. That's off the table now. They've got to wait until the next time Yahweh says, okay, now go, that fortress, there, attack. And Yahweh hasn't said anything like that. And so this attack is now unauthorized. If they had gone and attacked it when he first commanded them to, it would have been an authorized attack. His power and blessing would have been behind it. But that is over. That's expired. There is no order to attack these fortresses now. So when they go to attack those fortresses, when they try to walk back their previous refusal, now they are going without the Lord's blessing and without the Lord's power. And without those two things, this smaller, weaker tribe of untrained former slaves with very little battle experience, no military or combat training, they have zero chance at defeating these fortified Canaanite cities. The Canaanites were professional murderers, they were professional rapists, they were professional plunderers, they were professional land stealers, they were professional imperialists. The Israelites were former slaves who don't know what to do with a sword. They have zero chance of winning. And yet, Numbers 14, they try to walk back their previous rebellion by storming the fortresses there on the outskirts of the promised land without God's permission. And as a result, exactly what you would expect to happen happens. Lose miserably. And yet the important thing for us to understand is that this is actually the fourth rebellion. The third rebellion in their escalating series of rebellions was refusing to go attack the fortresses when God told them to. Their fourth rebellion in this long pattern of rebellion is now insisting on going and attacking these fortresses when God has not told them to. This is the big pattern. When the Lord says, you are set apart for this role, you must go willingly take up that role. But when the Lord has not said, you are set apart for this role, you must not try to seize that role for yourself. When the Lord says, you must go attack this fortified city, then you must go attack that fortified city. But when the Lord has not given you his explicit, unmistakable command to go attack some fortified city, you may not attack the fortified city. So, it's very important. The Israelites were prohibited from killing almost anyone, almost ever, almost any circumstances, period, unless it was one of the very narrow situations prescribed by the Mosaic Law in which you had to kill someone, stone someone, execute someone, or unless it was one of the very exceedingly rare situations in which Yahweh expressly told you, go attack that fortified city. When the ancient Israelites were obedient, they were the most peaceful nation in the world. But that is rebellion number 4. And that leads to kind of the climax. There's a sort of 1-2 punch. It brings us directly to rebellion number 5. Numbers 16, 1 through 3 says, Korah, the son of Jar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, the sons of Reuben, took men. They rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the congregation, called to the assembly, men of renown. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, you take too much on yourself, since all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and Yahweh is among them. Why do you lift yourselves up above Yahweh's assembly? This is commonly referred to as Korah's rebellion, but it's actually not just Korah's rebellion. This is not just the sons of Korah or the Kohathites. This is the sons of Korah or the Kohathites. Now, this is not all the Kohathites, but remember, the Kohathites were one of the clans within the Levites. Among the Levites, they were Kohathites, they were Gershonites, they were Merarites, and they had different roles, different responsibilities. But then there was the specific collection of Levites who were set apart to be the priests. So there were kind of 4 major distinctions among the Levites. And so a group from the Kohathites has joined forces with Dathan and Abiram, as well as On. Now, all 3 of these, they were descended from different clans within the Reubenite tribe. And then at the same time, you have 250 respected leaders and elders among all the different tribes. And so you have this massive collection, and they all get together and they declare that Moses and Aaron are false rulers. They declare that Moses and Aaron do not have any legitimate right to rule over and lead God's people. They are rejecting Moses and Aaron's divinely appointed roles, which, like we talked about, if you reject Moses, what you're actually rejecting is Yahweh. If you reject Aaron, the one you're actually rejecting is Yahweh. You were either saying Yahweh got it wrong by choosing Moses and Aaron, or you are saying God didn't really choose Moses and Aaron, or you are saying maybe God chose Moses and Aaron, but I don't care. We know better. In any case, what you are doing is you are rejecting the kingship of Yahweh and his kingly authority. You are rejecting the godhood of Yahweh and his divine prerogative to ordain whom he ordains. And if you reject the kingship of God and the godship of God, you are by extension rejecting the saviorhood of God. You cannot throw yourself on God's mercy to be saved if you do not submit to him as your king, if you do not worship him as your God. I know I say this often, but that's because I live in America, and America is just high all the time. America is just drunk on this insane ideology that says that nobody can ever really be the boss of us. We got it right like once back when we declared independence from Britain, and then we were just drunk on that Declaration of Independence ideology ever since then. We had the idea that no authority can ever truly be an authority over us. So American Christians are under the constant delusion that we're allowed to say no to God. What on earth would your major malfunction have to be if you thought there was a God of the universe who created and rules all things, and he told you to do these things, and you're allowed to just say no? I'm trying not to like use a cuss word here because like this should give you a very visceral reaction. The fact that it would ever even occur to us to think we can just say no to something God has commanded us. The absolute audacity of that, like the unhinged, insane degree of outright disrespect that has to be there to drive that. You need to be honest with yourself. Like, if God tells you, hey, you need to go to church basically every week, and you don't go to church basically every week, you are rejecting the kingship of God. That is what you are doing, and you need to be honest with yourself about that. If God tells you, you need to treat people this way, and you just, I don't know, kind of say, well, you know what? The guys on Fox News said, actually, I should really, really hate these people. Or the people on, CNN or whatever said that I should have a lot of disdain for these other people over here. What you're saying is Sean Hannity is a higher authority than Yahweh. What you're saying is Rachel Maddow is a higher authority than God himself. If God says this and you say, yeah, well, okay, but like, come on, it's 2026. Come on. What you're saying is that our particular cultural moment and kind of the pet philosophies of our immediate day and age are more authoritative than God himself. You are rejecting the kingship of God. The same thing is at work here in Korah's rebellion. They declare that Moses and Aaron are false rulers over God's people. They reject Moses and Aaron's divinely appointed roles. But even more than that, Dathan and Abiram, these are Reubenites from the tribe of Reuben. Now, Reuben was the firstborn son of Jacob. Now, culturally in the ancient Near East, generally speaking, the firstborn would be the leader of the household, the leader of the clan, the leader of the tribe. And in the case of Israel, generally speaking, if there is a nation that has about 12 tribes, then the tribe of the firstborn would kind of culturally, generally speaking, be the most prestigious, most powerful, most important tribe. Often that would be the tribe that kind of has authority over a lot of the other tribes. And so culturally, the Reubenites, such as Dathan and Abiram and On, they would just be kind of default presumed to be the leaders of Israel due to their status as the tribe of the firstborn. They're the heads of the tribes of the firstborn. And yet, remember Genesis, remember Jacob's deathbed blessing on his sons when he kind of prophesies what is going to happen in the future to each of these different tribes. He prophesies that the tribe of the Reubenites are not going to ascend into that position of power and prestige and status and greatness. They are not going to be kind of the heads over the other tribes. They were sort of rejected for leadership by Yahweh. And so these are the heads of the tribe of the firstborn who have been rejected for leadership by Yahweh, but they are declaring now that Moses has derailed Yahweh's plan by leading them to death in the wilderness. And they have a beautiful idea. They propose going back to Egypt and becoming slaves again. And so they are proposing literally undoing Yahweh's redemptive work. And they are, super curious about why they are not the ones God set apart to lead the people. So you have the most likely just kind of petty jealousy of the clans within the tribe of Reuben. You have some weird stuff going on in the heads and the hearts of a whole bunch of the Kohathites. And then you have these other 250 respected leaders. And everybody has just gone insane. They are trying to overthrow Moses and Aaron. And as we'll see, probably just kind of, it's generally presumed Miriam is sort of a part of this too in its own way. The entire family, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, everyone, is kind of a campaign to overthrow them. These rebel groups declare that all of the Israelites are equally set apart by God for his purpose and mission, which is true. That is not wrong. It is absolutely true. All of the Israelites, each of the tribes, have been set apart by God for his purpose and his mission. That's true. And yet, they follow it up with something that is not true. They say, therefore, Moses and Aaron are falsely exalting themselves over all the others. It is not true. Moses and Aaron are not exalting themselves over all the others. The Lord gave them a specific role, and that specific role has vested them with a larger share of the authority and responsibility than the other tribes, but they are not exalting themselves. And so these rebel groups, a bunch of the Kohathites, some of the clans of the Reubenites, 250 other respected, influential, powerful leaders, they are falsely accusing Moses, Aaron, probably Miriam by extension, and so on and so forth, of lying about God's will, lying about what the Lord has said, lying about what God wants, lying about what God is doing, lying about what God has set them apart for. This is the fifth big rebellion, but it actually gets even worse. Because after the dust has settled from Korah's rebellion, after all of the rebels involved in Korah's rebellion are super dead, which we are going to talk about in just a little bit, there is one final major rebellion here in this section. I wish I could say it was the final rebellion in the Old Testament. I wish I could say it was the final big rebellious mob in the book of Numbers, but it's just not. But the final one in this kind of big section here, Numbers 16, verses 41 through 43, it says, "But on the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, saying, 'You have killed Yahweh's people.' The congregation was assembled against Moses and Aaron. They looked toward the tent of meeting. Behold, the cloud covered it, and Yahweh's glory appeared. Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting." Basically, what happens is, as we'll talk about in a little bit, God sends an unmistakable sign. He displays his judgment. He displays his wrath on the rebellious Kohathites, on the rebellious Reubenites, on the 250 rebellious leaders. All of the ones from the Kohathite and Reubenite clans, all of the 250 rebellious leaders, God visibly displays his judgment on them. He kills the crap out of them in front of everybody. And yet, what happens is that so many Israelites, there is another group of rebels who refuse to heed God's visible display of judgment, and instead, they choose to stir up another lynch mob. They accuse Moses and Aaron of murdering the rebellious Kohathite, Reubenite, and 250 other groups. Essentially, their hearts are hardened to the point that they will deny their own eyes and ears. They will literally deny what they have seen with their eyes. They watched the ground open up and eat a bunch of people. They watched God send fire to consume a bunch of people, and on and on and on. They will literally ignore what they see with their eyes, what they hear with their ears, because their hearts have hardened so much at this point that they have lost the ability to think. And so there is this ever escalating pattern of rebellion, and this constant just churn and revolving door of new rebellious mobs go as far as forming lynching groups, throwing on their KKK hoods and everything to go kill God's divinely appointed prophets and priests and rulers and judges and so forth, and replace them with faithless usurpers. And so one really clear case in point comes during the refusal to enter Canaan incident. Numbers 14, 1 through 4, it says, "All the congregation lifted up their voice and cried. All the people wept that night. All the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'We wish that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in the wilderness. Why does Yahweh bring us to this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will be captured or killed. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?' They said to one another, 'Let us choose a leader and let's return to Egypt.'" The Israelites try to appoint a new leader to replace Moses and Aaron. They are rejecting God's kingly authority to choose the rulers of Israel. They are rejecting his divine authority to ordain who will lead them to carry out his plan and purpose. They are rejecting his wisdom to know which leaders to ordain. They are rejecting his trustworthiness to ordain the right people, and so on and so forth. And in that process, in this headspace where you reject his authority, his wisdom, his trustworthiness, and so forth, the Israelites prepared a stone, not only Moses and Aaron, but the faithful Israelites like Joshua and Caleb, because of the fact that they won't join in their rebellion. Numbers 14:10 says, but all the congregation threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb with stones. Yahweh's glory appeared in the tent of meeting to all the children of Israel. So these rebellious mobs are going as far as trying to kill God's divinely appointed leaders and replace them with faithless usurpers, and to kill anybody who doesn't jump on the rebellious lynch mob bandwagon. But the important thing for us to understand is that this never-ending series of rebellions is essentially a rejection of Yahweh's godhood and a rejection of his covenant. We see that in Numbers 11. Rewind it all the way back to the first chapter in this whole section. Back in the meat rebellion, back in the quail incident, it says that the heads of all the households were publicly declaring their dissatisfaction at the doors of their tents. Like we talked about, this was something often that you would do as a kind of declaration, a declaration that you were gathering together for battle, that you were gathering together with the rest of the men from the rest of the households to form a kind of militia to go fight some enemy, in this case, to go fight an enemy named Moses. This is a full-on mutiny stirring up. But it says that they actually actively begin to seek another god. They actively seek another deity. They actively seek another tribal deity and another king in order to seek out better gifts from some better king, better gifts from some better god, better provision from some better divine and better ruler. Say, Pharaoh was better than Yahweh. We need to go find someone else now who is better than Yahweh. They say, who will give us meat to eat? They say, Yahweh won't give us meat. We need to find a God who will give us meat. They say, we were fine under Pharaoh. We shouldn't have left Pharaoh for Yahweh. Now we need to leave Yahweh for someone else who will be at least as good as Pharaoh was. They are actively seeking to abandon the true God Yahweh and find a false God who will cater to their desires more. We see that same thing in the Korah's rebellion incident. In the middle of the kind of standoff, Numbers 16, 8 through 10, it says, Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, is it a small thing to you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of Yahweh's tabernacle, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you? Do you seek the priesthood also? Essentially, the sons of Korah, the Kohathites, they're saying all this stuff about Moses, all this stuff about Aaron. They are trying to seize the priesthood for themselves. And in all of that, Moses says, hey, I'm gonna just let the cat out of the bag about what this is really about for you guys. He says what's truly happening in the Kohathites who are rebelling is they want to use Yahweh's name as a tool to empower themselves, not to submit to Yahweh's rule and leading. They want the privileges of the Levitical line, which they already have, but even more than that, they want the priesthood itself. They say the privileges of being a Kohathite Levite are not enough. I want the additional power that comes from the priesthood. I want the additional influence that comes from the priesthood. I don't just want the privileges that come from being one of the Levite clans that cares for the tabernacle. I want to be one of the mediators between God and his people. I want the right to speak and people hear it as if I am speaking for God. I want people to treat my words like God's words. I want people to treat my authority like God's authority. I want people to treat my opinions like they are God's commands. They want to use Yahweh's name as a tool to empower themselves. They don't see this Levitical calling as a sacred responsibility to submit to Yahweh's rule and help the rest of the people do that. A sacred responsibility to submit to Yahweh's leading and then relay that leading to the rest of the people. They see the Levitical calling as a stepping stone to greater power and influence, greater prestige, greater status. They want to use God's name as a tool to empower themselves rather than allowing themselves to be tools in the hands of God. And so ultimately, both the Kohathite rebels and Dathan and Abiram and On, the Reubenites, along with the other 250 leaders, they are rejecting Yahweh's right and authority to divinely choose and set apart different people for different roles within his purpose and mission. They are saying, I will not play this role that Yahweh has told me. And saying that is a rejection of Yahweh's authority. They're saying, I will choose my own role, period. Whether Yahweh likes it or not. That is a rejection of Yahweh's divine power to ordain and set apart. And so the big question that this whole section of Numbers asks and then answers is, how do you get like that? How did the Kohathites, the Reubenites, 250 other important leaders in ancient Israel get to the point where they were even capable of pursuing this radical of a rebellion against their God and King? I think the answer that the book of Numbers gives is fairly simple. This escalating pattern of rebellion is rooted in our sinful nature's deceptive power over us. I think we see that in the way that the Israelites actively lie to themselves about their own past. This is in the quail incident, the meat rebellion. The Israelites actively start to lie to themselves about their past in Egypt. They say they had abundant fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic, and so forth back in Egypt. That is abso-freaking-lutely not true. They are just straight up BSing themselves when they say that. They are completely ignoring the fact that in Egypt they were enslaved, in Egypt they were oppressed, in Egypt they were regularly raped by their masters. In Egypt, they were regularly killed on sight for mildly annoying their masters. In Egypt, their children were taken as sexual playthings for Egyptian pedophile types. In Egypt, they were constantly being beaten, constantly being attacked, constantly being worked literally to death. In Egypt, they were constantly being treated like human pieces of meat. They were not okay in Egypt. But sin makes you stupid. It's true today like it was true then. Sin distorts our perception. We see here, it distorts their perception of the past. They're looking back at their past enslavement and oppression as if it were much better than it ever really was. It distorts their perception of the present. They're looking at their present difficulties as if it is much worse than it really is. And it distorts their perception of the future. It is moving them to ignore the promises that the Lord has made to them, the future that all of this is heading toward. We see the same thing in the Korah's rebellion incident. Number 16, 12 to 14, it says, Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and they said, we won't come up. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? But you must also make yourself a prince over us. Moreover, you haven't brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields or vineyards. Just like before, our sinful human nature distorts our perception. And so for these Reubenite clans, they are distorting their present struggle in the wilderness. The present struggle in the wilderness is bad. They're having a bad time. And of course they're having a bad time. They're in the freaking wilderness. But sin has distorted their perception, so this struggle in the wilderness feels unbearable. While their oppression and slavery in Egypt somehow now feels preferable in hindsight to these rebels in the Reubenite clan. It's an escalating pattern of rebellion. It is rooted in our sinful nature's deceptive power over our minds and our hearts. That is what Jeremiah 17:9 is talking about when it says the heart is deceitful above all things. It is desperately sick. Who can understand it? It says that our sinful nature causes us to literally lie to ourselves about things. One, the heart is deceitful. Our sinful nature causes us to want the wrong things, value the wrong things, crave the wrong things, pursue the wrong things. It is desperately sick, right? It's like when our bodies are sick, they don't work the way they're meant to. When our heart is sick because of our sinful nature, our hearts don't work the way they're meant to. And who can understand it? It is incomprehensible. Our sinful nature makes our hearts, our will, the seat of our desire, impossible to understand, incomprehensible, nonsensical. We become easily distracted by nonsensical things, easily deceived by nonsensical things, easily obsessed with nonsensical things, and so on and so forth. We are not primarily driven by reason. Reason is good. Reason is what we should be driven by, but it's not what comes naturally to us. We are primarily driven by appetite, by desire. And as a result, we will justify nonsensical, ridiculous things endlessly. And so there is an escalating pattern of rebellion that is driven by our sinful nature's deceptive power over us. And we see something actually horrifying, genuinely shocking at play, because in all of this, we see even Miriam and Aaron get swept up in this spirit of rebellion. This is from chapter 12. So this is earlier in our section, but I'm bringing it up now because I think it's easier to understand this episode when we have the context from the rest of this pattern of rebellion. We see Aaron and Miriam very briefly get swept up in this spirit of rebellion, but it's different than what we see with the Kohathites, with the Reubenites, with the 250 leaders. It's different from what we see in the spies who refused to enter the promised land. It's different from what we see in those 6 incidents from before. Here's what I'm talking about. So it begins in Numbers 12:1. It says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So Aaron and Miriam attack Moses for marrying this Cushite woman. Now, Cush is in Africa. It's part of modern day Africa. Now, Africa is massive, of course. It's a continent, not a country. But this is an African nation. Now, Zipporah, his wife, is a Midianite. However, we don't know whether the Cushite woman this is talking about is Zipporah, because it's entirely possible that Midianites had also made their way out to Cush, and so Midianites could have been referred to sometimes as Cushites. That's one common theory among some scholars. Or it's also possible that this is referring to one of Moses' other wives. He may have had an additional wife, either after Zipporah died or alongside Zipporah. We're not sure. Remember, this is the ancient Near East. It was very common for men to have multiple wives. That was not the norm that God recommended or commanded or anything like that, but it was very common. It was part of the culture. So it would not be unusual for Moses to have multiple wives. But so this could be either Zipporah herself, this could be another wife after the death of Zipporah, this could be a very standard ancient Near Eastern polygamous marital situation. We don't know. Whatever the case, though, Aaron and Miriam attack Moses for marrying a Cushite, which is very interesting. Now, Miriam seems to be the ringleader here. It seems to be implied in the passage. The pattern seems to be Miriam is the kind of bold ringleader. Aaron is kind of weak-willed. He's following weakly. So he's doing what he usually does. Same kind of thing that we saw happening in the golden calf incident. Aaron just kind of half-heartedly goes along with something that is clearly wrong. But Miriam and Aaron question whether Moses' unique, divinely chosen role is truly deserved. Take some kind of issue with the fact that he has married this Cushite woman. And they use the fact that he is married to this Cushite woman as evidence that he is perhaps not really who he says he is, which is an insane thing for Aaron and Miriam to say, because Aaron and Miriam have been with Moses throughout this whole thing. They have witnessed Moses talking to the Lord face to face. They have seen the Lord authenticate Moses over and over and over. Aaron and Miriam really have no excuse to be thinking any of these things, let alone to be pulling Moses aside and confronting him like this. The issue here isn't that Moses is above criticism or above ever getting pushback or confrontation. That's not the point. The point is, this is not a valid criticism of Moses. They said, has Yahweh indeed spoken only to Moses? Hasn't he spoken also with us? What's happening here is they are taking something that is true. Of course, Yahweh has also spoken to Miriam. He has also spoken to Aaron. We talked back in the book of Exodus about the fact that Miriam was a prophetess. And actually, honestly, I don't really think there's any need to distinguish prophetess. Miriam was a prophet, no different than any other prophet. Just like it, I know this is silly, it's silly gripe, but like there's no such thing as a deaconess. In the Bible, we see deacons who are men, we see deacons who are women, and they're just deacons. The English word deaconess it's a word we made up. The word Paul uses to describe Phoebe is the word he would use to describe really any other deacon, and so on and so forth. And the same thing here. Miriam is a prophetess or a prophet. And so the Lord absolutely speaks to Miriam. The Lord absolutely speaks through Miriam. The Lord rules Israel through Miriam. Miriam is one of the rulers of Israel in her office as a prophet. She bears authority in and over Israel, just like Aaron bears authority in and over Israel as a priest, just like Moses bears authority in and over Israel. He is functioning in a way that is both prophetic and priestly and kingly, in a way that kind of points toward the true prophet, priest, and king, Jesus. But so it's absolutely true. The Lord speaks to both Miriam and Aaron, and yet they are now denying the uniqueness of how God speaks to him. That God clearly speaks to Moses in a different way and on a different level with a different degree of intimacy and clarity and so forth. So what's happening ultimately is this constitutes rebellion against Yahweh from the leadership of Israel. Aaron is the high priest. Miriam is an important prophet. They both bear significant authority and influence. And if this spirit of rebellion continues to grow and fester with them, so that it becomes like what we see with the Kohathites, with the Reubenites, with the 250 other leaders, they could steer Israel deeper into rebellion than ever before if they are not corrected. Now, what was the issue with the fact that he was married to a Cushite woman? It's really not clear. The text doesn't say. Remember that this is the ancient Near East rather than 1950s America. So the issue that they had with the Cushite woman was probably not with the fact that she would have been black, right? She was African. Africans typically are black. A bunch of like Dutch people moved to Africa and started a colony, started South Africa. And so there's a bunch of white South Africans, but white South Africans originally were Dutch people. People native to Africa tend to be varying degrees of black. But that's probably not the issue in Miriam and Aaron's mind. So maybe the issue was that he had married a Gentile. And if this is his second wife, then they maybe take issue with the fact that he's married two Gentiles. Basically, he's married an Ishmaelite. Zipporah, as a Midianite, was an Ishmaelite. She was literally a descendant of the not chosen child, the not promised child. So that may have rubbed them the wrong way to begin with. And then if Zipporah dies, then he then goes and marries a Cushite woman. So maybe this is a Cushite former slave who came with them out of Egypt or something along those lines. They said, okay, first you married an Ishmaelite, now you marry a Cushite. Would it kill you to marry a Jew, Moses? And he said, yes, it would kill me. I have a type. Leave me alone. I don't know. But whatever the case is, they're taking some kind of issue with the fact that he has married this Cushite woman. And they see this pattern of you marry an Ishmaelite, you marry an African woman. The only women you apparently won't marry are other Jewish women. Moses, like, something along those lines is happening here, and they see that as delegitimizing. They see that as somehow casting doubt on whether Moses is truly the vessel that the Lord has chosen to work through. And if this spirit of rebellion against Yahweh's divine ordaining power, his kingly authority to choose, his wisdom in who to choose, and so forth, continues to fester in them, it could have disastrous long-term effects on the future of Israel. If perhaps the head prophet over Israel, Miriam, and the head priest over Israel, Aaron, join in the spirit of rebellion, terrible things will come. And so Yahweh addresses this spirit of rebellion within them head on before it festers to the point that they become like the Kohathites, like those Reubenites, like those 250 other leaders. Yahweh personally appears and he declares that he communicates with Moses more directly than with other prophets or priests, that he communicates with them mouth to mouth or face to face. It says, Yahweh spoke suddenly to Moses, to Aaron, and to Miriam. You three come out to the tent of meeting. The three of them came out. Yahweh came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the door of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. They both came forward. He said, now hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so. He is faithful in all my house. With him I will speak mouth to mouth, even plainly and not in riddles, and he shall see Yahweh's form. So God is directly confronting Miriam and Aaron, and he is saying, you are wrong. I am with Moses, and if you are with me, you will accept that. And then, because Miriam is seemingly the ringleader here, this is not God singling Miriam out in an unfair way. This is God almost certainly striking the ringleader in a very specific way. Miriam is struck with leprosy. God turns her hand leprous. And it's really important to understand what's happening here, because Miriam led the charge to attack Moses over his Gentile wife, his African wife, his Cushite wife. And almost certainly part of what she would have said would be, this Cushite woman is unclean. This Gentile woman is unclean. And God responds by turning her hand leprous, which would make her what? It would make Miriam ritually unclean. So the Lord is doing this kind of ironic, sort of poetic thing. He is doing to Miriam what she declared about Moses' Cushite Gentile wife. He is making Miriam like what she said about Moses' Cushite Gentile wife. At the same time, that ritual uncleanness would bar her temporarily from being able to enter the tabernacle, the sanctuary. It would knock her down from her position of influence as an important prophet in Israel during this moment of rebellion. And at exactly the same time, this ritual impurity now, because of her leprous hand, it separates her temporarily from the tabernacle, which represents the presence of God. And so she is visually, kind of as a metaphor, as an image, a representation, it is as if she is separated temporarily from this kind of metaphorical presence of God in the tabernacle. That mirrors the way that through her growing kind of spirit of rebellion, she has separated herself internally from the actual experience of God. She is, in a sense, resisting the Lord, running from the Lord's presence through her rebellion. And so now, because she has this leprous hand, because she is temporarily unable to enter the tabernacle, her external form, her external separation from the tabernacle kind of testifies to the way that she has internally been running from the Lord and rebelling against him, and the way that her heart has drifted. But in response to all of this, it says that Moses acts as a true prophet. He acts as a true priest. He acts as a true ruler, a true leader, by interceding for his attacker, Miriam, rather than going after her for revenge for questioning his authority. A leader who tries to get revenge on people who question their authority is a crybaby. A genuine leader will intercede for the people attacking them. And so there is this other irony. Miriam has accused Moses of being a false prophet, and yet he acts as a true prophet by interceding for her. She accuses him of being a false priest, but he acts as a true priest by interceding for her. She accuses him of being a false leader, but he acts as a true leader by interceding for her. And the implication of the story seems to be that Miriam responds to all of this with repentance, that Aaron responds to all of this with repentance. What is the difference between Miriam and Aaron versus the rest of the Israelites? It is that when Miriam and Aaron begin to get swept up in this spirit of rebellion, when they are confronted by the Lord, when they are corrected by the Lord, they respond with repentance and faith. As we are going to see, that is not the case with so many of the other rebels. That is all that we're going to have time for today. So we're going to pick it up right there in the next video. I know there's all kinds of stuff that you maybe still have questions about. Some of those questions are probably going to be answered in the next video, but hit me up with whatever questions you have about this and I will tackle them as soon as I get the chance. But between now and then, I love you guys. Take care and keep reading.